afternoon. Hello and welcome to the National Book Festival from the Library of Congress. My name is Guy Lamolinar and I work at the library. And I'm here with James A. Robinson, whose featured book at the festival is The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. And Mr. Robinson has written this book with Warren Acemoglu. Welcome, James. I should also tell everyone that if you log in to nationalbookfestival.com, you can see a unique video that James has produced for us, and you'll learn more about his book and get insights into the writing of his book. James, thank you so much for being with us. Glad to have you here.
My pleasure.
Let's begin the conversation. The title of your book, of course, raises many questions. You talk about the fate of liberty. What exactly are you referring to there?
Well, I think we're trying to provide a way of understanding why the extent of liberty varies so much in the world. And I think liberty meant in a very kind of straightforward way, as just in terms of kind of freedoms, in some sense, freedom of choice, freedom of decision, freedom of belief, and a freedom of conscience. And, this varies a lot around the world. And we're trying to provide a way of understanding why that is.
Were there any nations in particular that inspired you to write this book?
I think if you've read our previous book, Why Nations Fail, the obvious answer is, India and China. That I think because of our academic and scientific research, Professor Acemoglu and I have worked a lot in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and written many scientific papers based on data collected in those different parts of the world. But I think what we've been doing in the last 5 years is just doing an enormous amount of reading and trying to understand much better the historical dynamics of society in India and China. And if you think about liberty, on the one hand, in the Chinese case, you have this very persistent autocratic political system. And if you thought about India, on the other hand, you have this caste system, deeply embedded in society and the religion. So, I would say they're both examples, very different sorts of examples of illiberty. And so the book is an attempt to kind of expand the type of thing that we've thought about before.
I have a question from one of our listeners who's asking about the narrow corridor. Did it flow directly from your research for Why Nations Fail? Was it an organic transition? Did you have it in mind from the beginning?
I think the idea came up because, if you've read Why Nations Fail, in some sense, one way of thinking about the relationship between Why Nations Fail and the narrow corridor is the narrow corridor is much more about how do societies become inclusive? Where do inclusive societies come from? And I think the corridor came from thinking about exactly that, about what do you need and in what sequence and what comes first, inclusive political institutions and which part of inclusive political institutions. So I think it was something that sort of emerged, kind of as we debated and argued and kind of went backwards and forwards between, Why Nations Fail and things that we thought Why Nations Fail didn't really explain very well.
Tell us a bit about your research for this book. It's such a topical book. Do you go to archives to search these? Do you look at current magazines and periodicals, newspapers?
Well, I mean, all of the above. I mean, lots of different things. We tend to have, a lot of kind of ongoing scientific projects. For example, we talk a lot about the TIV in Nigeria and the TIV people and the historical political institutions of the TIV people and how they resisted centralization and they resisted the creation of states. And so I've been doing a lot of work in Nigeria, just north of there on the Jos Plateau, the north of the TIV region, and also south of there. I have a big archival project. In December, I was in Enugu, in the archive, the Nigerian National Archive in Enugu, sort of trying to find historical information. So that's like looking at archives. Of course, we read a lot of things in the newspapers, in academic journals, history books. Like inspiration and ideas come from everywhere, really.
Do you think America's influence on global politics has changed recently? And if so, how?
Yes, I think America's influence in global politics is diminishing rapidly. Both because the U.S. is sort of deliberately disengaging, because the current administration has a much more isolationist perspective than previous administrations, and also because you could say the world balance of power is shifting. Chinese economic growth over the past 40 years has made China into a sort of global player. Russia has sort of revived its geopolitical ambitions under President Putin. And so there's more competition, and there's both the US withdrawing from engagement in the international political scene.
Do you think that withdrawing will continue, or do you see an ascendancy for the US in the future?
I doubt it will continue. For one thing, it seems very tied to the current administration. And also, I think the negative effects of disengagement will become evident. We're all, as COVID-19 has shown us, we're all inhabiting the same planet, and you can't just ignore, the Chinese or the Russians, or you can't just turn a blind eye to Russian interference in Middle Eastern politics, in North Africa, and wherever it is, because that has negative consequences for the United States. And at some point, we just have to face up to that and try to combat it, I think.
There's so much talk today about inequality in America, racial inequality, economic inequality. Can you tell us how you think racial inequality threatens our future?
Well, I think, that's actually, we talk quite a bit about that in the new book when we talk about where inclusive societies come from. And how different types of inclusive societies are. So we have this concept of the corridor, but we point out that within the corridor, there's very different types of societies. Like Sweden or Denmark is a very different type of society from the US. I don't think, I think that's because the US had a very different type of problem to solve historically. The people who wrote the Constitution or created institutions in the 18th or 19th century had a very complicated problem to solve. How do you broadcast power and provide institutions to this enormous territory? And because I work a lot in South America, in Colombia and Bolivia, I tend to compare the US more to Colombia and Bolivia than Denmark. And then I say, well, the US actually did a heck of a better job than the Colombians did or the Bolivians. But albeit highly imperfect, this enormous increase in so yes, there's been an enormous increase in inequality in the last 30 years, and there's this persistent inequality, racial inequality. There's been a persistent marginalization of Black people, and exploitation and discrimination, and that's a disaster in many ways. It's a disaster because it undermines the prosperity of the country. It undermines the potential of many people. It creates grievances, and it undermines the legitimacy of the whole social contract. And there's been progress. There's been progress on that front, but it's too slow. And I do think that it's a wake up call at the moment. But at the moment, what worries me is I don't see. What was great about the civil rights movement was the civil rights movement managed to figure out where to push and what to do and what to prioritize. And at the moment, I don't see that. I don't see we know where to push and where to make progress and how to build coalitions in the way, you saw in the 1960s. But it's a terrible thing for the United States.
Are there any nations you think we could look to that perhaps are doing a better job than we are?
Well, as I say, I think the U.S. faced very different historical problems from many countries. If I look at Latin America and I ask, is there a Latin American country that's doing a better job? I think the answer is probably no. There's many other societies, grappling with these problems. South Africa, but I think in the U.S. kind of we understand what the problems are, and and there are many solutions, that are already known. It's just about building the political coalition to implement them, really.
Let's turn to economic inequality in America. How is that affecting our ability to flourish in the future?
Well, I think it's affecting our inability to flourish because more and more evidence suggests that it's your economic, it's what you inherit from your parents, it's your endowment, it's that determines what you can do and what you can achieve. There's always inequality in the world, but what's really a problem is inequality of opportunity. That the United States has been so successful because it's allowed people with talent and ideas and creativity to get to the top, to be successful, to start businesses, to become entrepreneurs, but that is becoming more and more challenged. If you look at evidence on that, there's more and more evidence that, innovation, comes from rich people. It's rich people who have access to better schools, to better colleges, and so that's a disaster economically. I mean, it's a disaster socially, but it's a disaster economically because it means you're excluding all that talent and potential. But and that's a catastrophe for the long run prosperity of the country.
I have a follow-up question from a listener here, and she talks about the fact that tax rates have funneled $1 trillion to the top tier of our society. COVID relief is being stalled in Congress right now. There are millions of people unemployed at risk of losing their health care. She asks, can liberty flourish in nations that are so highly stratified?
Well, I think it's very challenging. I mean, I think, again, you have to see these things, the way the US is organized, like the healthcare system, why it doesn't have universal healthcare in the way Western European or Northern European countries tend to have. That's very deeply rooted in the history of the building of institutions in the United States, a very decentralized federal way it was done, of the kind of mistrust in the central state. If you go back to when the US Constitution was written and Madison and Hamilton and all of that, there's immense mistrust in state institutions in this country. And I just think that's part of the culture in the United States. And that impedes the provision of many sorts of public goods that would be good for the society. And that now that's interacting. What the listener is describing is the way that's interacting in an extremely perverse way with the increased political polarization. The political system has never been so polarized as it is today, and so that just stops kind of agreement on matters like this Recovery Act, for example, which is clearly needed for people's welfare and for the health of the economy more generally. But it grinds to a halt because of this very polarized antipathy between the Democrats and Republicans that makes it so difficult to agree about anything. And so that's something, it's on a scale we've never seen before in the history of the US. And, it's deeply concerning, I would say.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you discuss societies going all the way back to the 5th century BC. Could you tell us about the most and least successful nations or nation states with respect to liberty of their citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think the modern world, I think, we talk about this a little bit towards the end of the book. We talk about ancient Athens and, how ancient Athens sort of faced institutional problems and how they built institutions and how they created the circumstances for liberty. Because I guess Professor Acemoglu and I tend to think, based on our research, that these are very enduring problems for human societies. And humans have been facing these problems for tens of thousands of years, and so we find that perspective interesting. And I think you have a lot to learn from how societies failed or succeeded in the past. I think if you look at history, if you study history, you see the modern world is in many ways, despite all the challenges of, climate change and inequality, in many ways, there is much more liberty than in the past. Think about human history has been absolutely full of, what we call extractive institutions in wide nations. Now, think about slavery or the coercion of labor. Until the middle of the 19th century, slavery was absolutely endemic all over the world, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Africa, in, everywhere, in South America. So I think there is more liberty at some basic personal level. There's more political, there's more democracy in the world. There's people live longer, more people have access to proper education and healthcare, but it's very unequally distributed, and it's very, very imperfect. And, my mother grew up in a slum in Middlesbrough in the north of England in the 1920s and 1930s, and places like that don't exist anymore in England. Of course, they do still exist in Brazil and Colombia and Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo. And so there's many challenges, in the world. But for me, the big picture in the modern world is that there is progress and there is improvement. I don't know which one country is more successful. Of course, the United States has been very successful, economically, technologically in that way. But it's also had, there's a lot of illiberty in this country, and more so than in Scandinavia, I would say. But as I mentioned before, I think that's just because of the very different historical problems that societies have to solve.
Your book has been summed up as concluding that liberty is as rare as it is fragile, wedged uneasily between tyranny and anarchy. Are there certain benchmarks or points of no return for maintaining the balance of liberty that you found is common across history?
I don't think we have a generalization really at that level. I wish we did. I think the context becomes very important. I mean, what we point out though is that historically many types of societies like northern Italian city-states, for example, which in the late medieval period probably had the greatest liberty in the world, went into reverse. And and there's different ways you can go into reverse, and you can sort of spiral out of the corridor. But just to give you an example from the news last week, somebody asked me where do I get inspiration and do I read the newspapers? Well, now what you have in the United States, you have President Trump, crashing through a kind of very conservative Supreme Court justice after last time when President Obama tried to do that. Tried to nominate a judge before the election, the Republicans wouldn't deal with it. Now, hypocritically, they'll deal with it because they get what they want. Okay? Where's the belief in the institution? What's the reaction from the Democrats? The Democrats start talking about court packing, the way Roosevelt tried to do in the 1930s. That's undermining the institution. So to me, that's like sets off alarm bells, because the Republicans don't believe in the institution unless they can get what they want out of it. And then the Democrats start saying, well, okay, we need to change the institution. And, that's the start of a very worrying, potentially very, very worrying dynamic, it seems to me. But saying something general is, I wish I could.
You mentioned the Romans being one of the most liberal societies ever and then turning back in the other direction. What direction do you think the U.S. is in right now?
I think what we point out, both our books, is the U.S. there's been a lot of challenges, to the institutions of the U.S. over time. It hasn't been plain sailing. Black people were disenfranchised in the U.S. South until the middle of the 1960s. That's not much of a success story for liberty. There have been very many bad presidents. People tend to remember the good presidents, but they forget the very bad presidents. So I think there have been many challenges, and so far the U.S. has always managed to face those challenges. And often it's faced those challenges successfully because citizens have mobilized, citizens have got together and pushed the civil rights movement, the populist, the progressive movement. They pushed for change and they demanded change, and they haven't let the politicians in Washington just do whatever they like, in some very polarized or self-interested way. So that's an important message from U.S. history. I I think the institutions clearly are under challenge, are being challenged at the moment, much more so than in any time in my lifetime, or I have any personal experience of. Is this comparable to the 1930s, or I'm not sure what the answer to that. The economic crisis now is much smaller than it was in the 1930s. We don't have fascism. We don't have the rise of Hitler or Mussolini. So the world context, though it's pretty nerve-wracking, it's not quite so scary as the 1930s. But it's, that's not to say we shouldn't be very anxious.
Broadening our conversation to the world, can you comment on why you think the global South is so bedeviled by failure? Are there general conclusions we can draw, perhaps from bearing the weight of colonialism?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what countries have been very successful economically, in the last 50, 60 years, where is it? Japan, China, East Asia, Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan. These are all countries that avoided being colonized by Europeans. I don't think that's a coincidence. The legacy of European colonization, whether it be in Latin America with these kind of very caste-based unequal societies, or Africa, where you create these completely arbitrary countries where it's incredibly difficult for people to cooperate and negotiate a workable, legitimate social contract. That's created negative legacies throughout the world, and Western countries endlessly carry on trying to manipulate and intervene. And, I always think, if you look at places in Africa that have been successful, like Botswana, why was Botswana so successful? Because the Swana people were themselves able to build institutions and a society based on their tradition, based on their legitimate, based on the legitimate history, and that they were fine, and they were able. But that's been so difficult for African countries to do that. And so yes, colonialism has had a hideous legacy on the global South, and it created poverty, and the legacy still makes it very difficult for societies in that part of the world to succeed and flourish.
We're seeing a surge of powerful nations today, such as China and Russia in particular, that disdain liberty. Do you think liberty offers an economic advantage, or is it a disadvantage?
No. I think that's a very complicated issue. I think I'm not sure I should admit this in public, but if you wanted my honest opinion, there's many things about China that I don't understand, and I think one of the reasons that China has been successful, so successful in the past 40 years is while, at the political level, there's no democracy, there's no accountability, there's no liberty. There's other kind of deep sociological principles in China which create liberty of some sort. So for example, you go back 2,500 years, if you read Confucius's Analects, Confucius said, promote the worthy and talented. There's this, that's just, in China, if you're talented and you can get ahead, you can succeed. I always talk, we have many China, not at the moment because it's very difficult for them to get visas or get into the country. But normally at the University of Chicago, we have many Chinese students, and if you talk to them and you ask them, where are you from in China? You see people come from some little village in the middle of nowhere. You can succeed, in China. And that's a very deep kind of sociological principle about Chinese society. It's very different from Indian society, but that's not, liberty doesn't come as a whole package we think about it in the West. But it does function in some dimensions because somehow the politicians can't mess with that because that's just the way we do things in China. So I've been trying to understand that better, trying to understand the way Chinese society works at some kind of deeper sociological level. So it's a good question. I don't really understand the answer to it, but I think that's something which is Professor Acemoglu and I at the moment are really trying to work on.
Okay. It seems that major shocks often result in a reduction of liberty. Like, for example, 9/11, we saw exponential increase in security measures. The pandemic has forced many of us to stay in our homes. How can societies recover from crises such as these? And what can we do to become more resilient in the future?
I think it cuts both ways, honestly. I think if you went back to the 1930s and you looked at the Roosevelt government, I think the economic crisis there, in some sense, forced people to understand that the government needs to do more. The government needs to do more to protect people, to provide social insurance, and that was a good thing. And I would say, for me, the COVID-19. Yes, there's been a huge amount of disorganization and incoherence in the United States. But I think it shows we're all in this together. You can't, you can be New Zealand and shut yourself off from the rest of the world. But that could be great for 6 months, but how long? You can't. That's not persistent. You can't sustain that. So we're all in this together. And we're all connected. We all depend on each other. So to me, that shows, oh my gosh, we need much more provision of collective goods. We need the government to do more, to help more, to invest more in health, and to stop this thing happening. So I actually think that's a good consequence of this COVID-19 outbreak. You can't hide your head in the sand. Yeah, we're under lockdown, but that's just revealing how vulnerable we were to a problem like this. And there'll be more problems like this. And climate change is a problem like this too. So maybe if we can work towards solving one of these collective problems, we'll figure out how to work on the other ones. So there's an optimistic interpretation for you.
I'll go back to the title of your book, The Narrow Corridor. Do you feel this nation, America, is moving into one of those corridors?
Well, I think we've been in the corridor. I would say, United States, for all its problems, it has been in the corridor for a long time. So, what concerns me is, whether it's heading out of the corridor. I study mostly developing countries. I've worked for many, many years in Colombia. I've worked all over Africa. I've been working in Haiti for the last few years. And I have to say, after you've been, in Haiti for a couple of weeks and come back to the US, you tend to think, oh my gosh, this is just such a fabulously functional place compared to being in Port-au-Prince or, wherever. And so I think that's just like a personal remark to say, I always kind of struggle to be pessimistic about the US because I work in so many awful places, because I've always found that to be, like, to me, that's just such a mystery, like, why is it, economists understand, and we have to understand what creates prosperity. They understand what you have to do. You invest, why is it so difficult to do that? Why is it so difficult to do basic things that every economist understands make a society prosperous? So I think that's why I've always been drawn to studying poor countries. But, not to say, as we talk about in both books, countries can go out of the corridor and they can go into reverse, and it has happened in history, and sure, it can happen again.
Do you think the concept of liberty is a global one, for example, or do you think it's subjective depending on where you live? For example, would a person in China think of liberty the same way a person here in the States would?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that the way we approach this in the narrow corridor is to say, this is a global human universal, the desire for liberty. I think that people often are in societies where there are very illiberal norms. We talk about India, for example, and in the book we talk about this idea called the cage of norms, where there are norms which limit your liberty, and I guess in many, and I think that's a very complicated question. I think, my impression is, if you look at people migrating, for example, where do people want to migrate to? They want to migrate to the places with liberty, with freedom of conscience, freedom of occupation. Of course, those countries also are the more prosperous ones, which is not a coincidence, I'd say. I think that's a complicated it's a complicated question that Professor Acemoglu and I debate a lot. You know, how do the Chinese think about their own society, and how do they think about their own institutions? And do they see something which we would say is, you know, kind of reeks of illiberty as a sort of legitimate aspect of Chinese society? I think, you know, you know, you can say that's a hypothesis about people that we're using to try to study the world, and I, you know, and I think we're still debating it and trying to understand it. But you know, that's a topic on which, you know, kind of well-informed and reasonable people could disagree, I suppose you could say.
Thank you, James. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I really want to thank you so much for sharing your insights into the world today. You've given us so much to think about. And I want to let everyone know that we've been speaking with James A. Robinson, and he is the author with Warren Acemoglu of the book, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. Thank you so much, James, for being with us today. And I wanted to let everyone know that they should continue to go on the National Book Festival website, where you can hear more from James. He is in the Understanding Our World stage, and that's at nationalbookfestival.com. And I also want to thank our audience for the great questions you supplied to us. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. Thank you, James, and thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the festival.